at it the other way, right? Okay, so ecological landscapes, when we talk about those, they're sort of an umbrella, right? There's many different types of gardens that can fall under something that's considered ecological. And we're not going to get into each of these, but just to give you an idea. So when we talk about permaculture, permaculture is really a garden that does production growth. And in that garden, we're looking at more perennial plants than annual plants, a more sustainable environment and working with wildlife in those gardens too. So permaculture would also be covered under there. Organic methods is something that we always talk about. We can't really invite wildlife into the garden without doing it organically because unfortunately they cannot they cannot be okay if you're putting chemicals in to the garden. And if you are doing it organically, you still have to be careful about what you're using and when you're using it. Just general wildlife gardening, right? You're a person who wants to get wildlife into your garden. You really don't have any other focus. You might not be looking to grow food or anything like that. You just want to make your garden welcoming. Sustainable garden, again, that's a garden that sort of tries to have very little input and keep as much in the garden as you can. So that would talk about things like composting, right? Whatever you cut or break down in your garden, you're keeping it in the garden and you're putting into your compost piles. You're harvesting water. That would also be something that would be sustainable, right? One of the biggest things that we talk about is no dig gardening. So, no dig gardening is really interfering and cultivating the soil as little as possible. Because we all pretty much now know there's a lot of life that goes on in that soil. And the more that we disrupt the soil, the more that we disrupt the life in that soil, and the less that we get the wildlife in there because we're not creating an environment where everything is let to live the way that it needs to. So when you're creating a garden like this, you really want to create an invitation, right? Really, a good thing to do is do some scouting and monitoring in your garden. Who are you seeing in your garden? When I sit at my desk at home, I see the swallowtails out in my garden, and I had to try to figure out what are they out there and what are they on? You know, what is the host plant that's attracting them, and how do I give them what they need the rest of the season? Because it's not just about the host plants for the current season. You're talking about the entire season, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So who do I want to invite? Maybe I'm not seeing anything, but my neighbor told me that they've got bluebirds in their garden, or they've got certain bees that have been ground nesting bees, maybe that they're seeing in their garden that are native to here. And I'm not seeing them in my garden. So what are some of the things I might be able to do? Because if I know they're at my neighbors, they certainly wouldn't mind hopping the fence and coming over if I'm giving them something good, right? The other thing I would mention is do not release beneficial insects into your garden. Okay. The reason you don't want to do that is if you're not already seeing those insects in your garden, you do not have the habitat that is going to support those insects or birds or whoever it is. The other problem is when you're buying insects offline or anywhere else, there's no regulation on those insects, where they're being bred, who's breeding them, if there's any if there's any disease issues, you have no idea of knowing any of that. So it's a fun thing to do sometimes and to think about releasing them, especially if there's kids involved. But usually if you put those lady beetles out there, by the next day, you're going to notice that they're not there because there is not what they need in order to stay in your garden. Why do we want to think more about ecological gardening probably than we have in the past? There's a lot of loss of species happening. When was the last time any of you saw more than a handful of lightning bugs? Yeah. We don't really see them anymore. And the reason is because there's so much development and so much land is being put into other types of planting that we're not seeing the things that we used to be able to foster previously. We have changing weather conditions, right? We might get the same amount of rainfall throughout a year that we had gotten in the past, but we're getting it in very different ways now. We are noticing if you did, especially last season, you had lots of rain in the spring, you had a total drought in the summer, and you had lots of rain in the fall. Um, we've got to think about making our gardens a little more resilient. And ecological gardens really follow the scope of a more natural garden. So if you walked out into a natural environment and you see that that's what your garden is a little more like. And those areas are a little more resilient because what they do is they shift and change with the conditions that they're in. Again, part of that is the storm events. We're getting washed out to some degree. If we're not preparing our gardens for that, we can be losing seeds that we wanted that fell into the garden that we want them to propagate themselves, or just running off soil that's healthy that we're losing. So we want to think about that as well. So we want our gardens certainly to be resilient to the conditions currently. As I mentioned, development is one of the biggest things that take in natural areas away. So we have to sort of look to ourselves and say, how do we compensate for some of what we're losing in other environments that we have control over? Also, we find that soil is a great place for carbon to be accumulated. We didn't realize that soil is as efficient as it is in sequestering carbon. The less you cultivate that soil and the more that you keep the soil as it is, the less you're going to interfere with that process as well.
Oh, we have a question.
Yep.
Let's see. Donna has a question. When I buy plants from the greenhouse, they sometimes have a stick packet that says that there are beneficial insects protecting the plant.
Beneficial insects protecting the plant?
Hmm. Maybe they're referring to that it's pollinated by a specific plant.
Yeah, I'm not sure
Pollinated by
what
specific
would
insect.
be protected by, but if Donna could maybe expand on that a little bit and give you a little more information as to what that tag actually says, that would be helpful. And certainly if that is the case, protected by, I'm really not familiar with that classification, but would be more than happy to find out whatever information I could to provide that. I will reference a few things during here, so what I will do is share with Corey a resource sheet so that anything I mention, websites or any of those types of things would be included on that resource. So there's a little bit of vocabulary that goes along with when we talk about certain things in the garden, right? Native. What does native mean? Native can mean very many different things to different people. It does mean plants that came from here, but where is here? If I'm in Maine, am I looking only at plants that are from Maine? Am I looking at plants that are from New England? Am I looking for plants that are from the East Coast? It depends upon what you're working on and what your goals are and who you want to attract into your garden as to how far you might want to take that region and spread it out. And there's lots of good resources, which again, I'll include on there, where you can find out where your plant is actually native to. So oftentimes people say it's native to Maine, or New England, but maybe Maine isn't one of the states it's included in. So those are things to think about. And sort of later on, I'll talk about it, but the University of Maine has a pollinator certification program. So if you wanted to think about doing that, there are some guidelines on there as to what the requirements for those plants are, how many different plants you need, and things like that. So when you talk about native, and there's also a big conversation that goes along with cultivars of native. So not straight species, natives that might have been crossed with other plants in order to get certain attributes that are good for the garden as far as what people want to see in the garden. The blooms might be longer, they might be bigger. But some of those plants, and there's a lot of conversation, and the research isn't there yet, so we don't know if straight species or cultivars, if cultivars are as beneficial as the straight species. Some of them are, but there's not enough research to really know at this point. Oftentimes you get cultivars from nurseries because it's a plant that's more attractive to people for some of the attributes it has. Oftentimes your Audubons that sell plants or land trusts that sell plants usually do a straight species. So there are some options out there depending upon what you want. When we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about species richness, right? The variety and the number of species, not the number of plants, the number of different species that you have in a particular environment. If you have various species in an environment, one of the benefits of that is if you have plants that might get pest or disease issues, and maybe you lose those plants because you can't treat them, there will be other plants to take their place or be there. If you use plants and use a lot of the same plants, if there are pest and disease issues, you could lose a lot more of your landscape than if you diversify. Not to mention when you're talking about wildlife, you certainly want to diversify because different things need different plants and they need different things during the course of a given season. So a monoculture is the opposite of that. A monoculture is a single species planting. An example of that would be what?
Field of corn.
Yeah, well, so in production, definitely. And you hear monoculture a lot of the times that relates to production, which is right. But when we're talking about wildlife planting, we're talking about what in the homescape landscape would be considered a monoculture, and that would be a lawn. Unfortunately, with the lawn, it's usually one particular type. It's just turf. Some of them have grass mixes in there, but a lawn really does not. If it looks like this and has nothing else growing in it, it really does not benefit any of the wildlife because there's nothing to be gotten from this lawn as it exists. Another one is when we use hedging that is all the same material, right? And for the same reason that I mentioned before, if you have any type of pest or disease, you could lose the whole hedge. If you mixed it with plants, and we'll talk a little bit about that, then you won't maybe lose the whole hedge if it were. Plus, a hedge like this, it does provide shelter, it does provide nesting, so it's important to have evergreens in the garden, but overall it might not provide as much as another plant that you could use in that same type of space. So some of the alternatives when we talk about regular lawns, right, are creating a meadow with a path through it that you could use. And lawns of and by themselves certainly serve a purpose. There's recreational purposes, gathering purposes for a lawn, but sometimes our lawns are very large, so maybe we can think about scaling those down so that we don't need that entire area to be a monoculture and we could use something else in it. So creating a meadow is a good idea. Just letting some clover or dandelions in your lawn. Dandelions and clover are one of the first things that the bees come out and find when they come out of the ground. Usually when you have a couple of weeks of 50-degree weather is when you're going to start seeing the ground nesting bees come out. And we know that they're going to be out for the season. And these are some of the earliest things that they can actually feed off of. Or have a lawn and just mow paths in the lawn and leave some of the lawn natural so that not only does it work for you, remember when we talked about these ecological landscapes previously, it's about humans and the wildlife, right? So in that case, it serves my purpose. I have places I can walk through the lawn and I can get through, and the wildlife can feed on, especially the pollinators can use those areas that I'm letting grow. A hedgerow. A hedgerow is sort of something that came more from the UK. And what it is a combination of plants. It's the same thing as a hedge, but it's a combination of plants that works throughout the season to foster wildlife. So it can be nesting, it can be berries that contain food, it can have multiple things in it that feed the wildlife or shelter the wildlife, but it's varying plants. So we talked about that diversity earlier. This would give you diversity in a hedge. So an ecosystem is living organisms, weather and environmental conditions that all work together and the components of that. So when we think about the plan for an ecological garden, when we're working on that, we want to think about habitat. Am I providing things where we just talked about that hedgerow, where birds, pollinators, whoever can live, even small mammals for sure, if you want to invite them into your garden. Are there places, sometimes just putting some wood bramble around, some small wood piles around is enough of a place to give shelter to some small mammals that might be in your garden. Water is extremely important, and water means water throughout the season, right? Just have water in the spring and the summer. If you're inviting the wildlife in, then what do they do in the fall and especially the winter if the water is frozen and you're not giving them a source of water? So I put a little pond in my backyard because I really wanted to invite some frogs in. And it's a wildlife pond. And what that means is there's no pump or filtration in there because that's not something you use with wildlife. It also graduates. So it sort of has a little shoreline, a rocky shoreline, so that if insects want to stop there or pollinators want to stop there, they're not going to drown. Because if the water is too deep, they can't drown in the water. So you usually want something that's a little more shallow. But that's going to freeze. Plus, it's deep enough that the frogs can hibernate in there. So I tried to think of everything they're going to need from beginning to end that will help them out. But what I do in the winter when that freezes over is I have two bird baths that I take off of the stand, your typical cement bird baths, and I put them on the ground and I put a heater in them, a bird bath heater, so that any wildlife can reach it. Because if I leave it on the stand, Only the birds can reach it, not anything else. So I put it on the ground, I put the heater in it, and I make sure that they've got water year round, which is really important. Host plants and food plants, right? If we're talking, especially if we're talking about our butterflies, there's plants that they will lay their eggs on, and their young can only feed on those plants. And then there's food plants that they need that are going to give them that nectar. And different butterflies or pollinators have an association with different types of host plants. So I talked earlier about who do you want to invite in, you're going to do your research and find out who likes what, and you're going to plant the things for those insects or butterflies that you want to see come into your garden. Uh, Oftentimes we use mulch in the garden, which is great, especially when you're establishing a garden, but the thought process currently is that maybe mulch, even though it's natural and it's wood chips and it's all the things that are going to feed back into the soil, that using actual plants like ground covers, especially types of sedges and grasses, make a great living mulch. So you're creating a landscape, you're creating a place for things to hide and be sheltered, as well as, and one of the things that I found with this in my own experience was if you use mulch around plants on a regular basis, oftentimes they can't seed as readily as if you are letting either the ground open or doing living mulch. Because the seeds are falling sometimes into thick mulch, they're not making it into the ground, and they're not able to seed themselves. I had visited a garden in New Hampshire at the extension office there, and they found exactly that. They had created a native plant garden. They had been mulching the garden because, of course, weeding it is extensive. But what they found was nothing was really seeding itself. And we always want the easiest way to get more plants is to either propagate them or let them seed themselves. So they weren't growing. They pulled back all the mulch and they found that the plants were seeding themselves much more than they had been seeing previously. So it's definitely something to think about. Again, like I said, if you're establishing a garden, mulch initially can work out fine, but it's not a necessity even then. Uh, Even when you're doing a living mulch, right plant, right place, rules still apply. What are the conditions? Is the soil wet? Is the soil dry? How much sun is it getting? You can't just put low-lying plants and various grasses into an establishment and feel that they're going to make it there. Go ahead.
Yeah, that test you were talking about, did they look into whether mulch inhibited rhizomatous growth at all, or was it specifically seeding?
They really didn't. I don't think it got to that extent. It wasn't really a research project. It was sort of something they learned from working in the garden and from, which is great, right? Because we all work around our gardens and we sort of have a relationship with our plants and we understand what they need and why they need it. And this was their experience. They didn't really take that research to another level.
I'd say, Corey, that from my experience is that it does inhibit
Yeah.
the seeds, but the rhizomes, I like, especially, it just, I see them still being able to make it.
Might slow them down a little bit, but not much.
It's like, more underneath,
Right.
but.
Yeah, so that's perfect. There's another thing, and this is for sort of a different type of planting, which involves these, what they call a matrix, which involves some of these carrots and grass that you do, is what they refer to as sociability of plants. There's certain plants that will spread at different levels, so that when you're thinking about planting those plants together, because you don't want to put plants in there that are aggressive, that are going to take out any other plants and compete with them. So the idea is they sort of have a rating, and I think I included that in there. So there's a sociability rating. So you've got primarily clumping, which means a plant that likes to stay where it is. So there's goldenrods that clump. You put them in the ground, they're going to mature, but they're going to pretty much stay where they are. You have some that sort of do a slow self-seed or creeping. They don't move too fast. So then there's moderate creeping or light self-sowing, a plant that's more aggressive. So these are things that you think about when you're putting plants together. Sort of how are they going to play together? How social are they? Are some plants going to move around more than others? So maybe I only put 2 of those aggressive plants in, or maybe I put 5 that are slow seeders, because then they're going to be able to spread around and they're not going to be a threat from the aggressive plants. And that's sort of a whole nother idea. but it's something just to think about when you're looking at your plant tags. How much seeding does it do? So one of the other things with ecological landscaping, when you're planting that garden from the beginning, you're thinking about the management of it down the road, and it's usually for the long term. You want to get to a point where your involvement and input in that garden becomes less and less over time. When we talk about cultivated gardens, like ones we might have around the outside in front of our house, a foundation planting or things, we're talking more maintenance. We know we're going to need to divide those plants at times. We're going to need to do maybe some mulching on those plants. We're going to do deadheading, all those things. And a lot of the times we find that out after we put the plant in, right? We bought the plant, now the plant's not looking so good. We do a little research and we understand that plant needs to be divided every 2 years, and we didn't know that. So that adds to the maintenance level of our garden. But when we're managing, we're thinking from the get-go, that sociability factor, am I going to have to take some of those plants out? We don't really want to do that because we talked about we do not want to disturb that soil as much. So we want to think about creating an environment that's sort of over time going to be more self-sustaining, and it's going to learn to shift as the weather shifts with the needs that it has. So maybe there's more rainfall and there's plants in there that like more rain than the other ones, or there's drought in certain plants, and they're going to learn to shift and be resilient a little bit more on their own than when we look at a regular cultivated garden. Anybody have any questions thus far? So maintenance is more task oriented. There's more organization in it. There's a higher input when we talk about maintenance, and there's more involvement over time to maintain that garden. Management is more ecosystem focused. It starts in the planning phase and the design. It's future minded, and it's usually for the long term of the garden. So just to give you an idea of management, what management might be is maybe you have a garden that you need to do some cleaning up in, but you want those plants to be able to seed. So what you might want to do is cut some of those back and let them drop to the ground. It's sort of a chop and drop mulch idea, plus you're putting the seeds back into that ground. So that would be something you would think about. What type of management do I need to do to help that seeding along possibly? Or you collect seeds and you distribute them throughout the garden. But it's not labor intensive, right? It's not a lot of manipulation of the soil itself. Stems are nesting sites. Mallows are one of the greatest plants for those pithy stems. If you see that stem on there and how open that is, solitary bees love those. They like to nest in them. Some of them nest in the ground, and it's nice to have a sandy spot for them where they can get into the ground and they will nest in there. But other ones like the pith. So if you cut some of those plants back, but you leave them standing enough, just like when you see a pollinator house and it's got the wooden pieces in there and they go in there and make their homes, well, this is the natural process. You don't need to install pollinator houses necessarily. You're giving an environment that your plants are providing. Also, some of your sedums are good for that. If you cut them back and leave them high, but you want to cut them back so that they have that ability to get into there. Uh, they are, and which we'll talk about too when we talk about leave the leaves. There are plants that particular pollinators might like, and they are going to overwinter around that plant or in the ground by that plant. A lot of them do not overwinter, but there are phases, different phases, usually the chrysalis, but it could be different phases where they will look for a place to stay in the ground because you're going to find them next winter or they're going to come out next winter. So you want to have plants along that line as well. We talk about leaving the leaves. That's a discussion you've probably all heard over and over again, leaving the leaves. But the question is, why do we want to leave the leaves? They feed the soil, right? They provide habitat and a soft landing. The same thing I just mentioned about some of the items, the insects and the pollinators that will overwinter, they provide a place for them to do that. If you're going to leave areas like that, usually you want to leave those leaves whole. You do not want to mulch them or shred them or do any of that because you're going to be disrupting what's ever in there. So you want to do that in an area of your garden where you know it's not going to be disturbed. The reason we do that, Luna moths overwinter. Lightning bugs also overwinter. Amphibians overwinter. If we have a garden that's so cleaned up and pristine, they have nowhere to overwinter, which is part of the reason that we're not seeing the lightning bugs and other insects. Some of them, unfortunately, we're just losing because they don't have enough habitat. But other ones, it's because we're not giving them what they need during the winter in order to survive the winter to come out on the other end. We don't have to necessarily leave the leaves in our garden because I know myself, I have so many maple and oak trees around my house, which we'll talk about that in my neighbor in a minute. But there's leaves, more leaves than I want to leave in the garden. But you can create corrals, right? You can create areas where you're accumulating the leaves. You can mulch those leaves because you're not necessarily seeking them out to shelter. You're leaving those elsewhere. These can be used as compost going forward if you needed it over time or added to your compost pile. But if you can't do them all at once because there's so many, you can create structures that are relatively attractive that you can store those leaves in. I have two. I have one in my front yard and one in my backyard that I've created a corral that keeps my leaves in there that I can use for the future. A dead hedge. A dead hedge is a great place to, if you have branches that come down, and this is one that I made, if you have branches that come down, the branches go in there so you're not bringing them to the municipality. You have no idea, and I don't know the numbers off of the top of my head. I've done it for another presentation I did. The tonnage of things that get brought to the municipalities for disposal that could be kept in the garden, whether it be leaves, whether it be branches, try to find a use from. Like we talked about with sustainability, that's keeping things and having a closed system where you're keeping them. So this serves as wildlife habitat. I see the birds going in and out there, the chipmunks are going in and out of there. I can certainly use some of that wood if I want to in my fireplace over time. I can't certainly use all of it. I need a place to put it. In addition, what happened here was because I started leaving the leaves and most of my neighbors don't, my neighbor came over with a plate of cookies and said to me, here's some cookies, but we're going to need to put a fence up because we're cleaning leaves much later into the season than we had been because I was leaving my leaves and they were blowing over to the neighbors. So in order to find a way to keep both of us happy, I wanted to still leave my leaves on the property and not have to take them off property. They didn't want them blowing over. So what I did was along that side, I put a leaf corral towards the back that created a natural fence that the leaves can't get over to them because I dump it in from the wheelbarrow. I put this dead hedge, which the leaves do not get past the dead hedge. They collect in front of the dead hedge. And I had a tree removed, well, not removed, I left the snag, but I had a piece of tree that kept falling and I was concerned about it hitting the cars. And I had them cut that up when they did it. And I made an extension to this dead hedge that takes it out towards the road. So I've created a totally natural fence that is a habitat, right? Because even the logs, anything can live in there. The dead hedge they're using and the leaves also do the same thing. And all of that was kept on my property. Leaves are not for all plants either. Some of them do not like to be under leaves. So it's important you know the plant. If you're using leaves as mulch, make sure one of the native plants, which are pussy toes, which are host to some of the butterflies, do not like to be covered in leaves and you will lose them over the winter. It's just too wet for them. So you want to make sure you're not putting the leaves on them. Pest and disease issues. If you have pest and disease issues in your garden, you might have to clean up leaves and you might have to put them in a corral and let them sit, or you might have to dispose of them depending upon the severity. I'm not telling you to leave the leaves at the cost of your other plants. If you do have pest and disease issues, leaves can often spread things. So you want to make sure that you're not using ones that aren't. Ticks are a big issue, of course, because ticks will hide in the leaves as well. So the recommendation is based on your own property. If you have an area away from where people are doing their recreating or going in and out of the house and you can keep it in a far off corner, then try to do that. You know, this is all information as to how you can create that garden. Then what you need to do with that information is apply it to your particular site and what you do or don't want to happen in your garden. Leaf mats, first thing, the shredding of leaves. So like I mentioned, for the wildlife, for overwintering, You don't need to shred them. If you're putting them in a compost pile or elsewhere or in the garden, you might want to run them over with the lawnmower first, which is helpful. Also compost pile.
We have a question.
Yep.
Do you have to put the chain link fence on sides of the
No,
bench?
definitely not. It just helped mine because I used the branches as the posts and I couldn't quite get them into the ground, although I did use a post hole digger. So I felt that in order to reinforce that, but you do not need to do that by any means. Again, having the general concept and adapting it to what works best for you. So when we talk about cuticare, right? A lot of people say, well, wildlife gardens, pollinator gardens are messy. They're not messy, they're just different. But in order to show people that you have an intention with that garden, right? That there was a reason you didn't mow the lawn entirely and you just did a path down the lawn. Things that are cue to care are signage, educational, right? I have two signs out front of my house. One of them talks about the leaves and one of them talks about my yard being a humane garden. It's intentional that I want wildlife to come into this garden, which is why I'm not mowing it constantly. I'm not using chemicals in my garden. It's an education. Chairs. If you look at this garden, right, you see the messy maybe what people would, or not as formal as some settings. But the fact that you put the chairs in there, it's intentional that you set this up as a sitting place, as a place that you want to spend time in. Paths, fencing, even small fencing can definitely make a statement in a garden that it says there is an intent to this garden. It's not like I just forgot that this garden was here. Also, there's great programs, and I'll just talk briefly about two of them. Again, I'll provide these resources. Citizen science programs, which are absolutely great. They're online. So two of the ones, so what you're doing is you're observing, it helps you identify things, and it helps you share that information. So two of the bigger ones currently that I'm familiar with and use are Homegrown National Park, which is something affiliated with Doug Tallamy. If any of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy and the books that he's written that talks all about ecological gardening. And what you can do is you can register your yard on Homegrown National Park, and you can put in all the plants that are in your garden, the native plants, and you can add to that over time. Because oftentimes when we're doing ecological work, we look at our little space and say, but am I making a difference? Like, what is my little yard doing, impacting? How does it impact all the land that we're losing? And what this does is it gives you a map of everybody else who's registered. And you can see that if you have a situation like this, where all these yards have native plants, where all these yards have the same mission that you do, now you can see the difference that's being made. That map is from across the United States. If you look at the full map, and you will see all the work going on everywhere. So you're just a small piece of a very big puzzle of what's happening. The other one that's absolutely fantastic is iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's a great site. You take a picture of something, you upload it, it makes suggestions as to what that is. So it's great for helping you identify it. There is a community on there that can identify for you if you aren't able to identify yourself, that will actually look at your postings and say, this is what that is. You usually need 2 or 3 people that give you the same ID, but confirm it. The other thing is, this is the same thing as like iNaturalist. It's across a scope. If you were working in a garden with a group of people, when I was in New York, I worked for Cornell Extension and we had a small demonstration garden. And what we did is we set up what they call a project. So everything within that garden for each individual garden got accumulated under one project. So you could sort of see the impact you were having on a larger scale. When I put some of my frogs on there that came into that little wildlife pond that I created, my observations were used in somebody else's projects that was studying the frogs in that area. So now you're sharing sort of scientific research. How else would someone know what's happening around in various areas if you were doing some research on trying to save, let's say, amphibians or the insects, but you can now see what other people are posting. So you can see where are we losing, where is their gains. And so it's an excellent website, even if you are not comfortable with posting on it, which There's no reason not to. I would say just take a look at it and see what's out there. So like I mentioned, you post a picture, you add your location because that's important that they know what's happening where. They will give you suggestions and then the community will help you ID it. Garden ecology comes in many shapes and sizes. You don't need to convert your entire garden to be ecological. If you have a garden now, you maybe just want to add some to it. Maybe you want to put a little bramble pile in. Maybe you want to put native plants in because you're not planting native. It's not all or nothing. Any little bit that you do that helps the ecology is a step in the right direction. If you don't have a garden and you just have a small space, you might want to put some pots out there. You might want to put some pots that'll feed the pollinators. Or maybe if you have a little bit of grass area, you can put a little bit of clover in there or let the clover grow. Never think that you have to reach this point because it all comes in small steps. So it's not something that you need to do entirely new and different. And I think with ecological garden, what we really need to do is change the perspective of what gardens are supposed to look like, right? Like I said before, we talk about them being messy. They're not messy, they're just different. They're different than the cultivated gardens that we've seen in the past. So we have to change our perspective on what a landscape looks like, how it functions. We don't want to work against nature, we want to work with it, and we want to invite that wildlife in, which was not always the focus of our gardens. It was more an aesthetic, right? What blooms the longest, what blooms the biggest. Those are things that come with this, but they're not the focus of why you're putting that garden in or why you're putting those plants in. And as I mentioned earlier, Maine has a pollinator certification program. If you have an organization, I think the Norway Library was certified, right?
Yes.
So the Norway Library, McLaughlin Garden here is certified. So it's just a matter of going on there. There's a course that they offer if you want to do it. It gives you guidelines to what the requirements are. You fill out an application, your application gets reviewed. And even if you don't want to certify, it's still great resources to understand how you can create that environment. You don't have to take it to the certification level whatsoever at all. So that's everything, unless we've got some questions.
I think, just to the certification,
Mhm.
later, it doesn't have to be like your entire yard. Like if you have several gardens, there's different areas, you can certify just one garden. And that could be a
Right.
pollinator garden. So it's not as overwhelming as it could be or seem, but it's just a couple of steps and, you just could select the area in your garden that you want to.
Yeah,
certify.
it's small scale and it's something that is real user friendly. So the requirements are not here. The requirements are, I am a homeowner that wants to start making a difference and I'd like to get that certified. And it's pretty basic what you need to do in order to do that. And the Lourdes is actually one of the people that sits on that committee and looks at the applications. So they do outreach. The committee does outreach. If you have questions about it, if your application comes through and for some reason maybe you missed the number of plants or the bloom time because it's got to be throughout the season, they will come back to you and say, hey, did a great job. We just need to do a little rearranging and we can help you get to the finish line on this. Any questions?
Donna had clarified what
Okay.
she's talking about. She was referring to the sachets that you sometimes get on plants, the beneficial insect, like pouches that come with them. I
Okay.
think the question was, is that like an issue or is that of concern?
I will be honest that I don't know enough about it to comment on it at this time. I will certainly look into it and let you know, but I wouldn't want to say one way or the other without having more information.
Yeah.
I have not either. That's
I-
why I'm
I-
not sure.
I've seen them in like the nursery trade, but they do them in agriculture and in production. And
Okay.
in like a greenhouse space, they can be effective because the beneficial insects tend to stay in the greenhouse.
Okay.
Or die out, because they don't have what they need. But in like an open garden space, unless, like you said, they don't have the environmental and the plants that they need to feed them, they'll just disperse.
Right. So the little bit I would say is don't depend on them staying there. It doesn't mean they're going to be a hindrance, but I wouldn't depend on them staying if you don't have the habitat for them. And again, the one thing I mentioned is there's no regulations on any of that, so you don't know.
Paula has a question. Do you have recommendations for hedgerow shrub plants that do well at a forest edge? Combination of plant groupings, berries, flowers, and blocks the road.
So what I would actually recommend is looking at the Wild Seed Project. Heather McCargo, who was previously affiliated with there, still is, but was the director there. She's done some presentations on hedgerows. It's really like any other plants. You really have to get your soil tested because it's got to be right plant, right place. You can't, I wouldn't make recommendations without knowing what the pH of your soil is, what the moisture level of it is. There's information out there that she can certainly get. I think even the university might have a fact sheet on there for hedgerows. So like any other part of your garden, how much sun are you getting on that hedgerow? So I would go with those recommendations.
How long do you need to leave the leaves before you remove them in spring?
So in spring, like I mentioned earlier, usually when you've got at least 2 weeks of 50-degree weather, you can start doing cleanup. Before then, there's things are still hibernating. With 2 weeks of 50-degree weather, usually things are starting to come out of the ground. They're not hibernating anymore. You can certainly extend it a little bit. It's going to be different. Of course, you're doing the temperature 50 degrees, but each year it's not going to be a time thing, right? It's not going to be the third week of March. You've really got to know what the temperatures have been. So I would not do any cleanup or remove anything until you've had those 2 weeks of 50-degree weather.
And is that overnight too?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
for the most part, yeah, because they're still going to be hibernating if it's not that warm.
Mhm.
When you say no dig, so you're not adding, you don't want to add things to soil that aren't.
You can add compost to it. You can certainly top coat with compost because just your weeding will work that compost into the soil. No dig is sort of, if you're creating a new bed, you're better off doing what they call layering. So you put some cardboard, and there's questions about cardboard because some of it can have chemicals in it. Usually they say to recommend cardboard that was used for edible products. So there aren't you put cardboard down and you put mulch on top of that, or you can put newspapers, wet them, and then put the mulch on top of that and kill off grass areas if you want to create new beds. And the best time to do that is in the fall, so that by spring, you usually have a cleared area there that you can start working. If you are going to do any cultivating, that would be the time to sort of open that up, take any of the remaining turf out. I wouldn't even recommend it, but if you were going to do it, that first round would be the only time that I would dig deep into that soil. Any other questions?
Do you have recommendations, say in a garden like that for Japanese beetles? I thought of that when I saw the mallow, because my mallow is always loaded with Japanese beetles, which of course.
You know, they talk about Japanese beetles, the best way to handle them is manually.
Soapy water.
Right,
Yeah.
because unfortunately, if you put the traps up, you're going to be attracting them from your neighbors as well as from your own backyard. So usually the manual process, first thing in the morning, I think is the recommendation to do it. And really, that is probably the best one. And, you know, the other thing is too, like you're saying, they got your mallow. It's also the amount of population, right? Part of investigating and scouting and becoming familiar with your garden is, do I have an insect issue that is so intense that it's going to take my plants out? Or is it just something that they're feeding on the leaves and you know what, my plants all made it through? I have Japanese beetles. I have not collected them or taken them out. I don't know if somebody else is getting them, but I haven't had enough damage that would cause me to go after them with any great degree because I've got plenty of other chores to do. If I saw where it was getting to that point, so that's why it's important to scout. What's the tolerance level? Where do you say enough is enough? Anything else? Like I said, I'll put some resources together for some of these items that I mentioned in here. I will share that with Corey and he will send that out to you so that you have that. And certainly if you have any other questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me or to Corey who can get in touch with me.
One thing I wonder about periodically is I would love to see some kind of native plant swap
Oh,
Because I have stuff that self-seeds and I end up with too much of it and
yeah, and there
I
are,
would love to find people who want some and trade it for something else.
there certainly are groups that do native plant swaps, without a doubt. It's no different than any other plant swap that they do. I don't know if you're familiar, there's a group that started a garden club in Poland. They're on Facebook. I can give you that information. Are you
I'm part of the group, yeah.
part of the group? So we've got someone right here that you could talk to. That maybe those type of things might be things that they would be interested in doing, or,
Yeah.
yes.
I don't think we have enough.
Yeah, and I'm not saying,
We talked about that, we talked about a seed swap.
right, but I
I
think the important thing is the community, right?
Absolutely.
To know who to talk to about those types of things. And I think when you have an organized group, even though you're new,
Yes.
those are the people to talk to, because those are where the ideas come from, and the community is there to reinforce that. So that's great. So I'm sure you would welcome any questions after this if anybody wanted to approach you about it. I know I'm in Gray New Gloucester just started a garden club, same type of thing. I think they reached out to your garden club. So it's nice to see that, because there were certain areas that didn't have a garden club, and I think those are the places where people can get together and talk about those types of things. Of course, the master gardeners do some things like that as well. And if there's anything that the extension can do to facilitate some of that, we certainly would be willing to have a conversation about it.
And I think as part of our club, we've all joined the Maine Federation.
Yes,
So
yes.
every one of these little.
Right.
And I haven't been onto their page to see, because that would be a great way to connect, is if every one of these little clubs then.
Yes.
Right.
And then I can go there, I don't have to go over here.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and that's it. That's the network in the community, right? So even though you might not be ready to do those things, you've
Right.
joined a community that has been doing it, that can talk to you about that.
Well, thank
All right.
you.
You are most welcome. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening, and we have some more nice weather that takes that snow away and we get to see the ground.
Be sure to tune in next week. We have a presentation on frogs and their amphibious and seasonal lives by master naturalist Jana Magnuson. Hope to see
Excellent.
everyone there.
Or are you gonna do the big night? The big night this year?
I'm trying to think about how we could